Angie, thank you so much for joining us today. We are exploring the changing world that nonprofit marketers and fund developers are facing here in our COVID-based era. So, Angie is a story brand certified coach and has been working in the nonprofit space for a very long time. She brings lots of experience to the table. And today we're going to have a conversation about telling your brand's story during quote unquote an unprecedented time in our history here together. So Angie, maybe start by just sharing a little bit about yourself and what you do. How did you get to where you are?
Yeah, sure. Well, like you said, I'm a story brand certified guide and copywriter. So, primarily, most of my time is spent in two camps. One, helping people identify the story that they ought to be telling that will most resonate with their audience. And then two, bringing that story to life in their marketing collateral. So, on their websites and their email sequences, lead magnets, following a story brand formula the whole way through.
Mm-hmm.
My background, how did I get here? Well, I'll tell you that I started with a bachelor's degree in social work, and now I do. I always thought that I would be a hospice social worker. That was kind of the train that I wanted to go on, and just really loved helping, and that was kind of the drive behind that. And um, I worked in higher ed for about 7 years, and I moved over into the nonprofit space. I was the director of a child sponsorship program, and it was there that I was introduced to the story brand framework. I applied it at the organization where I was working then. And
Mm-hmm.
within about 6 months, we saw a 25% increase in child sponsorships once I applied the framework there. So I knew that story brand is a real gold mine. I started doing some other projects on the side and just fell in love with it, saw it working, so much so that I finally left about a year later and have been doing it full time for about 3 years now.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. I love that journey from sociology into marketing. Now, I'm a little bit biased because I have the same journey,
Okay.
but I feel like sometimes as marketers, we forget that if we don't understand our audience and what they're going through, uh, it's impossible to really talk to them effectively or communicate our message effectively. So I know, as I'm sure some of our listeners do as well, that the story brand framework has been getting a lot of attention over the years, but that ultimately it's basically based on a framework that's existed for thousands of years.
Right.
And Donald Miller, I think, did a really good job of packaging that up and kind of simplifying it and modernizing it. Um, when you think of where we're at now
Mm-hmm.
versus where we were a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the challenges that you see when it comes to a brand telling that story?
Yeah. One of the major components to storytelling is number one, you've got to first know who is your audience, who are you talking
Mm-hmm.
to, and what is it that they want as it relates to what you offer. That's the starting point. The second piece that's really critical is that your nonprofit business, whatever the case may be, your offering ought to solve a problem that's standing in the way from your customers, your donors getting what it is that they want.
Mm-hmm.
So, what we're seeing now in this last year is that the problem that your audience is facing has changed. And when that problem pivots, the whole story pivots. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're telling a new story because you're serving your audience in a new way. And so
Mm-hmm.
we have to define how do we tell that new story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's get really like in the weeds with it for a second. What is an example of that? So if we're using that general concept of the hero, the villain, the stakes that we're facing. What does it look like to switch to current times, as it were?
Yeah. Well, I think, if we use child sponsorship, since that's a field that I know pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
if we use
Mm-hmm.
those, my job used to be to um, work with the development team to attract new sponsors, but then also to retain them, make sure that those we have are sticking with us and continuing to support for as long as their student was in school.
Mm-hmm.
And that story that we would be telling just on a regular basis would be our audience cares about the world. They want to make a difference, and they
Mm-hmm.
probably really care about education. And so the problem that we might be solving for them is they want to help in the world, but
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how. And so the problem that we're solving is we're giving them a solution to that.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that change in COVID?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it may actually pivot from it's a different kind of problem that we're solving now. So it may be the problem they're facing might be we want to help. We
Mm-hmm.
still care about the things we've always cared about, but your donor's story has changed. So now their resources might be limited. They might have different priorities. And so we also have to layer in that story where typically in a environment where our audience is thriving, so they have a
Ah.
job, they're doing well, things are fine. Um, our story can be much more focused on the beneficiaries problem
Mm-hmm.
and being a means of solving our beneficiaries problem versus the problem might actually turn into more donor specific at this point,
Mm-hmm.
which might look something like um, we know that you want to help in the world. Either number one, you don't know how right now, who to
Mm-hmm.
trust, where to give, or two, you can't give as much as you once did. And you
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure that you're still making an impact with whatever you can give. So there's intricacies within that story that you just want to dive into a little bit deeper and switch the story up.
Mm-hmm. Angie, I love the way that you're thinking about that and the way that you're describing it. I know one of the frameworks that I've seen used is this idea of there being an education phase. Maybe that's the first phase after, Corona hit. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's kind of that solidarity phase of, yes, we can together. Here's how. And then I've also heard it described that there's kind of this new normal, quote unquote, a phrase that I think is getting beaten to death a little bit yet. But what phase do you feel like we're in as marketers? And what's an example of someone who is really making it into that quote unquote new normal stage well with their brand story?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's where are we now? Probably somewhere between the last two, and I think that empathy really matters. That being empathetic to the needs that our audience is facing,
Mm-hmm.
while also finding an authentic voice that doesn't sound um, inauthentic.
Yeah, I don't know how else to describe that, right? But don't be inauthentic, I think is so important right now.
Yeah, I think that we're used to seeing there's memes out there now. There's like these videos that, essentially every commercial that we're seeing, whether it be nonprofit, for profit, that we're seeing like the same quiet music, and it's in the sense behind it for the stage that we just left, those early stages, that makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now people just kind of want to cut to the chase. They're looking for the same things that they're always looking for. How can you make my life better? What's in it for me?
Mhm.
And even donors feel that way.
Mhm.
We like to think that those who are partnering with our organizations, even ourselves, that we're selfless, but we
Yeah.
are. There are some there we are good people and we're talking with good people, but there are selfish motivations even when we're giving, that
Mhm.
it's meeting some kind of need for us.
Mhm.
And so if we can cut to the chase
Mm-hmm.
and authentically speak. I think we're ready for some positivity. I think that what I'm seeing, the trend has been just sad,
Yeah.
dark, and these are very
Yeah.
serious times, and it was appropriate. But I think, like you said, we're quickly moving out of this phase and people are just ready for hope. I think about this, just feeling this way in my own life. We had a great Memorial Day weekend. We got to be outside. The weather was good, and it's just like this fresh. We're ready to act. We're ready to take action, and
Mm-hmm.
we're ready for hope and positivity
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit more upbeat kind
Mm-hmm.
of vibe is what I'm
Mm-hmm.
sensing in my part of the world. But I know that's different no matter where you are.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, as we kind of consider how to make someone the hero of the story, a lot of that, I think, as you're mentioning, comes down to okay, it's time to kind of articulate action. What what do you do though if you're a nonprofit that really doesn't have an action that relates to the current situation? Um, some causes connect more directly, as you know, than others to what's going on in our current climate. What do you do if your cause just doesn't really, connect?
Yeah.
Do you
Um,
pretend that it does, or?
there are probably some connection. I mean, what has COVID not touched? And so
Yeah.
there's probably an underlying connection where if you help with if there's something in terms of education, well, schools
Mhm.
are upside down right now, and
Mhm.
around the world schools are
Mhm.
upside down. There are some real obvious links to those in the medical providing space and food and all the clothing, all those kinds of things, but there are that just feel like a little bit different. And what I would say is it's probably you will have more success if you strategically engage with those who already love you. This is probably a
Mhm.
very hard time in that sense. If you're truly disconnected from
Mhm.
how COVID is changing the world, which I think is probably few and far between, I, this is probably not the time to connect with new donors.
Yeah.
It might be challenging, but if you can dig in with those who already love the work that you're doing and are already engaged,
Mhm.
just remind them about it and use this time to say, hey, we know the world is crazy, but here's some good things that are still happening. Like just
Mhm.
showcasing that work is still happening. Just because this big problem went away, there's still the same problem that you've always wanted to fix is still here.
Mhm.
You can still help, and just really digging your heels in with your current audience for the summer. I'm hopeful that, gosh, I just really hope this fall we're going to see some
Yeah.
movement
Yeah.
here, but at least for the summer, dig in with those who already love you.
Yeah, I love that idea of focusing on those who are already intertwined into our story. What's like a practical example of that? I mean, if you've got 20 minutes with someone who's working full time at a nonprofit to help them out, what are you going to do for 20 minutes that might be useful with that in mind?
Yeah. Um, I would just be thinking about what are your normal communications? How have they changed? Your typical communication strategy. Do you have a typical communication strategy? Are you talking to them regularly? There was a period of time where you stopped doing that, maybe pulled back a
Mhm.
little bit to be sensitive to the times, which is really appropriate.
Mhm.
Um, but thinking about emailing your audience, it might be a fun time to do a print piece in the mail too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's very actionable when if people are insecure about the resources and financial support that they can offer, they can still do. One of the things we used to do with child sponsorship was, of course, you can write letters to
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
child. We
Mhm.
sometimes do little activities for families like fold this paper airplane. Here are some decorators for it. Write a message, and then we're actually going to send your paper airplane to your sponsored child. And it didn't cost them anything, and it cost
Right.
us a little
Right.
bit. But what it did in turn for us is it made our donors more invested so that when it was time to ask them to give later, then they're
Mhm.
invested. There's a story
Mhm.
that they're part of that story and engaged. So think
Hmm.
about ways to engage them this summer that might be
Hmm.
outside the box.
I love this idea of sending, something actionable in
Yeah.
the mail where I can, maybe it's a coloring kit that my kids can use, or some sort of adult themed craft or activity. I think that's really, really neat. And sometimes we forget that digital is not the only not the only touch point. At least I know I do as a digitally minded person. I love those examples. What do you think you're going to do differently in the next 3 to 6 months with some of your clients to shift their story from maybe phase 2 to phase 3?
Yeah. Um, I'm spending a lot of time with clients right now, making sure that their core messaging is really good. My clients tend to have a little bit more time than they normally do in the current
Mm-hmm.
season. And so they're saying, let me take advantage of this opportunity to make
Mm,
sure that when life gets back to normal, or this new normal that we're talking about, that we've crafted the right story. Our website is great.
mm.
Our email sequencing and lead magnets that we have in place are really solid. And um, so, how will I help them? I will position them to help them position themselves to come out of this really well. That's where we're spending
Yeah,
most of
yeah.
our clients now.
Yeah, so really taking advantage of, if there is downtime,
Mhm.
leveraging that as an opportunity to redefine or, sharpen the brand footprint and kind of clean house a little bit
Yeah.
behind the scenes. That resonates especially with me. I know we're doing that. I'm sure a lot of your clients are doing that too, kind of cleaning up our brand and getting ready for a relaunch, as it were. Do you sense that that's something that we don't do often enough as marketers? Do we get caught too much in the day to day and forget to step back and think about the big picture?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
my I run operate my own business, and I forget to do that with my own funnel, my own sales funnel that I have, I've actually taken a little bit of time this spring, even that, the sales funnel that I have running, it's serving me well, but it hasn't been touched for almost 2 years. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
even if you live and breathe marketing, it's so easy to get caught up in doing the day-to-day work. To actually
Mm-hmm.
take a step back and reevaluate makes a whole lot of sense right now. And looking at what you've got with really fresh eyes and saying, okay, in this new world, how does this translate? um,
Mm-hmm.
and things have changed, and have changed probably forever to some extent. And so, how does this translate in the new world? Are we connecting with our audience in the right way, and being really intentional about taking a month to do that this summer,
Mm-hmm.
and just literally looking, how are we talking to
Mm-hmm.
our audience? What does our website say? What do our email sequences say? What are we sending in the mail? And how is it serving us? And
Mm-hmm.
taking time to evaluate that.
Mm-hmm. I think that, as marketers, there's a lot of people telling us, hey, it's a good time to kind of double down on your own brand. What do you think stops people from doing that right now? Is there resistance or hesitation? And if so, what do you think that's driven by?
Yeah. Well, two major things come to mind. One is that it's always hard to look at our own brand with
Mm-hmm.
fresh eyes. We're often too close to it to
Mm-hmm.
say, I don't know, it
Mm-hmm.
works for me, because it's what we've seen, and we know we live and breathe our organization's work on a daily basis. And so we can't see what we can't see.
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
ingrained in us. It's hard to
Too
see.
close.
Yeah, we're too
Yeah.
close. It's hard to see. So that's
Mm-hmm.
number one. People often get overwhelmed with where to start, and what is the problem. Even as we look at this, what is the tension with our current audience? It's hard to define.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with an in-house team, it can be really hard to define.
Mm-hmm.
Two is people are worried about budgets. People are worried
Yeah.
about, do they have the kind of money it takes to think about. I just had a client yesterday, or a prospective client, talk to me, and she said, it's never right. We either don't have the
Time.
money, but we've got all the time, or we don't have the time, but we've got all the money because things are.
Yeah.
So it feels like there's never this right place,
Hmm.
but I would challenge that to say, um, number one, if you don't do it, how much will you lose in the future? If you don't take a
Yeah.
time to reevaluate, there's a cost there. But you can get really creative with how it doesn't have to be a totally new website build. Maybe your
Hmm.
design is great, but you just need
Hmm.
a refresh on the words.
Hmm.
There are a lot of people like me in the story brand community who will offer coaching services that are at a
Hmm.
much lower cost than hiring someone like me to write your entire site, to just come in
Hmm.
and give you that fresh perspective to say, oh, this doesn't make sense to me. This didn't land with me. Or in this new world, I feel like you're going to have some resistance to this kind of language. And
Hmm.
investing in something like that, which is kind of smaller scale, is really worth
Hmm.
doing. But
Hmm.
yeah, that would be the pushback, is that
Time
people,
and money, right? We
yeah,
never we
money.
never have enough of those, especially as a nonprofit. We never have
Yeah,
as much of
that's right.
those at the same time as we want. What helps you sell the brand conversation to a board typically? Is it, uh, what sort of ROI related data are you using?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. There's, I would say, the story brand philosophy is really powerful. Nobody sells it better than Don Miller. So if
Yeah.
someone, so if someone who is for those who don't know, who is the founder, creative story brand, wrote the book Building a Story Brand, and the follow-up book Marketing Made Simple, which will change the way that you do business.
Yeah.
And
It's awesome.
and so what I most often, I am invited to partner with nonprofits because someone on the board has gotten excited about Story Brand. And
Hmm.
so you can get your board excited about Story Brand. There's a really great podcast that just send to your board and say, hey, we're really thinking about this approach. It's a less than an hour, the podcast. It's Don Miller and JJ Peterson. It's episode 65 on
Mhm.
building a story brand. Uh, Podcast, and it's
She even
fantastic.
knows the episode number. I love
Yeah,
it.
well, because I recommend it all the time. Episode 65, and it just gives an overview of the framework, and he builds in all of that, the ROI conversations of if you can spend, and he would say, Don Miller would say, read the books and do your best to implement on your own as well, and it can be
Hmm.
very cost effective.
Hmm.
But get your board excited about this idea of using the power of story to connect with your audience in a way that will compel them to convert, to take action, and it will pay off for you in the long run.
Hmm. Angie, help me understand a little bit. So I think big picture, as a marketer, I start to understand this idea of telling us a meaningful story, maybe a more empowered or a more empathetic version of that story, with things being what they are today.
Yeah.
Help me understand some tangible examples of, like, what does it look like to tell a story well? We hear this language, storyteller for hire, a lot, and I think there's a lot of value in it, but what does it look like on my Instagram feed, or what does it look like on my LinkedIn page? What are some tangible examples that you feel like I should know about?
Yeah, great question. So when you utilize the story brand framework, it takes us through the key points of story. So here's the
Mm-hmm.
misconception that people come to me most often. They say, you can help me tell my story.
Hmm.
Then they send me their personal bio, and they said, they make this good, make this work,
Make it better.
make this better. And so we naturally think, and it's no fault of anyone, because it's the way marketing has been done for decades, probably centuries, of how our if we tell our story, our business story, our nonprofit story, if we talk about all the good things that we do, then people will
Mm-hmm.
naturally be inclined to partner with us. And that's just not
Mm-hmm.
how our brains work. Our brains
Hmm.
are, like I said before, are looking for those things that are going to help us survive and thrive. And we use story as a powerful way to focus the mind. So if you think about, the last time you went to a movie theater, which feels so long ago now,
So long ago.
you went to a movie theater and watched a movie, or if you're like me, at the end of the day, if my brain is running, then I'll read a book or I'll watch a show. Once our mind is engaged in story, it's capturing, it's focusing it. There's rarely any other competing thoughts once you're really engaged in the story. So we're using that same power to showcase to our audience how we're helping, how what you're offering helps your audience survive and thrive. So what does that look like in practical, real life? It means having a header section on your website that showcases the value that you add in very simple caveman like terms. It means defining those story points. Like I said, for social media, you'd ask, how do we use this in social media? Well, once you go through the story brand framework and identify those elements of story, character, who is the character in our story, which is who's our audience and what do they want as it relates to what we offer. We want to identify that. We want to identify the problem they're facing, the thing that's keeping them from getting what they want. We want to position your organization as the guide in the story. So no longer is the story about you, but you're an important part of the story. So how do we position you as the guide to help your audience overcome the problem they're facing to achieve the success that they want? There are a few other points in the framework as well. But once you've broken those key talking points down, you start using those key talking points really consistently. So when it comes to social media, you might have on Mondays, you focus in on talking about the problem. So again, you're establishing empathy. If you can showcase, give voice to the fact that you understand the problem your audience is facing as it relates to what you offer, then they're going to feel like you understand that. That's the best hook, is to showcase that you understand the problem they're facing. So maybe you talk about the problem on Mondays and offer a teaser at the solution. Maybe on Tuesdays, you're establishing authority as the guide. Again, we've positioned you as the guide in the story to help them overcome the problem they're facing, achieve the success that they want. So we showcase things that make you showcase that you're a competent guide to follow. So what awards have you won recently? Have you been published somewhere recently? Do you have testimonies that you can share there? And so using those story points to actually help you map out your social calendar would be a really practical way to bring story to life.
I love that. I love the idea of taking it and connecting it to your calendar. That feels so like hands-on, practical. Oh, I'm going to take these points and now they're going to become these little pieces of content.
Yeah. And I was grabbing for it because I have here it is. I have the Marketing Made Simple book, which is the most practical tool. So it's the follow-up to building a story brand. Talks about how do you define the story, how you define those key talking points. Marketing Made Simple then says, okay, now you have those story points. How do you use them? There's a chapter in this book called Wireframing a Website That Works, I think. And it literally says, here are the 7 sections that you need to have on your website, and here's how to write them. And it leans back into those key story points that you've already defined with building a story brand. There is no more practical book that I've ever read than Marketing Made Simple. And it literally says, here's what your homepage ought to look like. It's the same framework I use for all my clients. It's really good.
So cool. So cool. So you're adding a book to our list to read, and we'll be looking for a big check from Donald Miller, I'm sure.
Right.
For mentioning that.
I get no commissions for this, but it is literally the most marketing.
We'll get $1 million and then we'll split it between the two of us. Right. So what a meaningful conversation I feel like this has been around telling your story as context shifts beneath our feet. Final question for me today. So what brand out there is doing something that you feel like we should emulate along these lines right now? I always think back to and it's so easy to think of big brands, right? Because they have bigger budgets. So I want to be careful not to suggest that we all have $1 million budgets, because we don't. But I always think back to Dove and the way that they did some of their storytelling in a way that I felt like really empowered. Um, they had a campaign kind of targeted at the female audience, where they were really empowering the female audience to kind of take ownership of the story and to be a part in it, and to kind of share stories of their own with a unified hashtag. So that's the one that comes to mind for me. What about you? What do you just brag about to other people as
Yeah,
far as inspiration goes?
that's a great question. In terms of today's client or in today's climate, I don't have one to rattle off the top of my head for who's doing it really well today. I'll say that who I follow, who I like to watch in the market just in general is Charity Water is my favorite.
Ah,
Yeah,
yep.
they have a really great way of making a problem that seems very far away, drinking
Mm-hmm.
water and the impacts that come with that, and making it applicable to our lives today. So they do a fantastic job, and they're when it
Mm.
comes to nonprofits, they're the ones to follow, and their messaging is all very story branded, and they
Mm.
do a fantastic job. Yeah.
Yeah, they have such a neat story. I feel like there's very few people in marketing that work in the nonprofit space that don't obsess over charity water, because they're
Yeah.
just there's certainly something to emulate there. So neat. Well, Angie, you've made time on your calendar during what I know is a very busy part of your life. So we want to really thank you for joining us today and for helping to have this dialogue. Any parting thoughts before we go?
No, sure. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'll always offer that on angieschultz.com. I offer a free 5 minute review. It's at the very bottom of my site. So if you do feel like you're in that space where you're too close to know what's not working on your website, I do probably a dozen reviews a week of just popping in, taking a look at your site, recording my thoughts for 5 minutes to say, hey, as a prospective donor for your organization, here's what stands out to me. I love to do those. And yeah, it'd be a real pleasure. So angieschultz.com at the very bottom, just fill out that form.
Love it. A fresh set of eyes and a guiding hand here today from Angie. Angie, we hope that you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of our Continue Change series.